Welcome to the Justice Journal podcast. I'm Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert. I hope you enjoy this podcast series where we discuss important public safety issues and provide insight into who we are as an office and what we do both in the courtroom and in the community to provide the highest level of public safety through prosecution, prevention, and innovation.
In the last two episodes, we gave the background and history of the Richard Hirschfield case and the DNA hit that turned the case around to the trial.
Today, we're going to talk through the trial process to the return of the verdict.
So we're going to pick up in 2012 when the trial of Richard Hirschfield begins. So Dawn, what were some of the key pieces of evidence that you presented at trial?
Well, first, I think it's important to realize it took a long time to get to actual evidence. We started litigating in limine motions, well, actually some of them years before 2012, but we got technically started with trial in January of 2012. We started jury selection in July. We started evidence in September. So there were a number of evidentiary hurdles we had to overcome in the pretrial motions of the case. The key pieces of evidence in the case were, of course, the semen stain, which included a mixture on the blanket that had been pristine and a gift wrapped in the van that belonged to the Riggins family that Sabrina had got for her sister. That DNA profile and that 1 in 240 trillion number was the primary incriminating evidence against Richard Hirschfield. Also, the fact that it was a mixture, which means that it also, some of the samples, there were multiple stains that were taken in samples, contained a mixture that also contained Sabrina Gonzalez's DNA profile. So we know they were in the same place on this blanket and in this sample. So that was key. The fact that Richard Hirschfield was a sexual offender came into evidence. In California, we have a law that allows us to enter evidence about someone's prior sexual history in terms of their criminal convictions because it shows that they have a sexual deviancy. And that's what Richard Hirschfield did. So we were allowed to introduce evidence of the prior rape in Mountain View. Margaret came in and testified a compelling way as if it was happening. And she's, of course, a grown woman now. She was in her 20s at the time. We had the victims from Washington State come in who had been 9 and 11 and who were in their 20s at the time of our trial. So the jury was able to hear about who exactly Richard Hirschfield was in terms of his criminal conduct. They got to hear about the DNA match. Another key item of evidence happened to be a note from his brother. And I'll let Ron talk about how that came about because that is what kind of kicked off the 2002 investigation of this case.
Well, it started with the 2002 investigation. I was still at the Sacramento Sheriff's Department, and as I mentioned, Detective Cabral and Newton were assigned to work on this. And when it finally got enough time that they were going to serve a search warrant and later an arrest warrant for Richard Hirschfield up in Washington, we'd all gotten together, all the detectives, and we all took assignments. Some people were supposed to, the idea was that we would interview at the same time so that avoid any phone calls and so forth from one another, all the family members, close family members of Richard Hirschfield. So a lot of people went to Colusa and Williams, his hometown. My partner and I at the time, Clark Fancher, went up to Oregon to visit his brother Joseph. I think Dan and Ed, the two main detectives, went to Washington State to talk to Richard. Washington State Prison. So my partner and I go, we talk to his brother's at work, and we just say, listen, your brother Richard, do you remember where he was during 1980? We're trying to get background information. And then we mentioned, he's going to be arrested. His DNA was found at a double murder scene in 1980. And that's why we're asking these questions, essentially. And his brother said, oh, all right, okay. And it wasn't a real long interview. It was mainly just to get background information because we didn't know that much about Richard Hirschfield then. And then we come back to Sacramento, and I'd come into work, and my partner gets a phone call, and he goes, guess what? And I said, what? Well, that was a coroner from Clackamas County or whatever the county was in Oregon, and they found Joseph. He committed suicide. So what had happened, and again, this rewrites rules and how to conduct yourself is during investigation. So now we were brought in to the fact that why did he kill himself? Well, he left this note, and I'll read parts of it. And he leaves a note in the car, and it says, well, honey, I didn't really know how to say this, but I love you more than anything on this earth. But I've been living with this horror for 20 years. I was there, and my DNA is still there. I'm so sorry, but it's in the past, and there's no way to go back. And I wanted to tell you last night, I didn't want to see the hurt in your face, so I'm sorry. So he leaves this in the car, and then, of course, we have to go, holy crap. And then, so then we now this is good evidence, but at the same time, it brings up an issue we'd never thought of. And a lot of people working DNA cases never thought of. Well, you got to get all the family members, get DNA from them, make sure they weren't possibly there. So then we had to collect DNA from other family members. But now we have to look, even though he's dead and we can't prosecute him, we have to look into Joseph. And that's why this note, and Dawn fought like crazy to get as much in as she could, because Joe becomes extremely important when you consider this starts in Davis. 40 miles away is where the van and the two bodies are found. In between and just off the freeway, I mean literally off Freeway 50, is Joe's, where he's living now. He's living in this mobile home in 1980. So you spoke earlier about, what are some of the changes? Well, biggest change is what's in your pocket, and that's your cell phone. Now you can call anybody in the middle of the night and say, hey, pick me up, pal. Wasn't the case back then. What we end up finding out, essentially, what we're able to piece together is, sure, Richard picks up Joseph at some point in time because he's going to need a ride back. He has no way to get back to Davis where this started, if that's where his car was from, or anywhere else. Because you don't want to drive this stolen murder van back to your house in Williams or Calusa, wherever you're from. So he's got to get a hold of somebody he knows. Well, he knows Joseph. Joseph is a mechanic. Joseph knows cars. Joseph works on cars. And obviously, what we didn't know before this moment is that Joseph was in fact there. And his big fear is that, his DNA is going to be found, and that's why he kills himself. But we had no idea Joseph was there. And we still wouldn't had this letter not surfaced. And that was another part of the investigation that we learned from. What we didn't know, and were later told by, if I'm not skipping ahead too far, we're later told by Joseph's wife at the time, who he wrote the letter to, is that she used to watch a lot of these crime shows. Joe was a mechanic. Joe would go out in their big garage, work on cars and stuff for hours on end. She'd be sitting inside watching these different crime shows. And Joe would pass by to get a drink or a snack, and she'd go, hey, they got this guy. They have DNA on the case. They've got DNA in the case, that's it. And then, well, you get that enough in your head. So when we're interviewing him, I'm taking notes, and my partner says later, he says, boy, when you mentioned DNA, Joe really started shaking. And I'm going, oh. But it doesn't have the whole picture until you get the phone call the next day that he died. Well, he had it in his head from his wife and these shows that if they've got your DNA, they're going to find you. So he writes the note and says, hey, I was there. My DNA is still there. As it turns out, Joe, after we began to investigate Joe, had a vasectomy. So his DNA was not there. and his DNA was never found there. So if he wouldn't have done what he had done, we never would have known that he was there, and we never would have known that that's how Richard got back. We would have always thought, hey, how did this happen otherwise? Because from the scene where the bodies are, somebody must have driven by. You pass a place called Rudy's Hideaway, where there's a phone booth outside, and that's how you got a hold of somebody. You had to make a call. And later, Joe's wife says, oh yeah, Richard teased him about Rudy's Hideaway, because they both knew where it was. And Richard was kind of torturing Joseph at the time, and nobody knew. She didn't know about it, and we didn't know about it.
Also part of that suicide note, Ron read you what's called the redacted version, where some of it has been taken out. He also incriminates his brother Richard. People hear that and they think game, set, match, right? There's a suicide note where he's admitted the crime and he's incriminated his brother. But there's a difference between what we know happened and what we can prove in court, what is admissible evidence. So there was no way that Joseph's dying declaration about Richard being guilty was going to come into evidence. The law doesn't allow it. So we had to take those parts of the note out. We litigated. It's very unusual for any kind of suicide note to be admitted at trial. I've had lawyers ask me how it happened, and yet members of the public, including my own husband, said, I don't understand. That's such compelling evidence. Of course that comes in. And you have a right to cross-examine the declarant, the person who said it, and Joseph is dead, so you don't get to cross-examine him, so you don't get to put on that statement unless there's a hearsay exception. What we ultimately ended up getting that suicide note information into evidence by means of was a very unused portion of the evidence code, which allows a declaration against social interest to come into evidence. What that means is if someone is unavailable, dead, and they make a statement that subjected them to the risk of making them an object of hatred, ridicule, or social disgrace in the community, such that a reasonable person would never say it unless it's true. That's how we got that in. No one's going to admit to a brutal sexual kidnap and murder unless it's actually true. And so that's why the judge ultimately decided that information was credible enough to come in. But we fought hard about that fact. So the suicide note was a compelling piece of the evidence at trial as well.
A redacted version.
A redacted version that did not contain the portion that incriminated Richard Hirschfield. It also had a dual edge to it, though, because what it also did was provide the defense with the ability to argue that Joseph is the real killer. So we had to face that argument at trial as well. And I think showing who Joseph was, the fact that he had been bullied by his older brother, he didn't have this past criminal history, and the fact that, and the way in which Richard Hirschfield's DNA is found mixed with Sabrina, it was easier to argue that Joseph may have participated, but he was not the person who committed these murders.
So let's talk a little bit about the defense's, or I don't know if argument's the right word, or explanation for the evidence that you presented.
So there were a number of defenses brought up in the case. The defense team had 2 primary lawyers and a DNA attorney, and they argued a number of different theories, one of which was that the Hunt group really was guilty and that there was this copycat aspect to this crime that had nothing to do with Richard Hirschfield. And we could never show any connection between Richard Hirschfield and any member of the Hunt group, which is something that the investigators from Yolo County tried even after our DNA hit to see if they could find, and it just wasn't there. So they tried that defense. There was a hair found on John Riggins' sweater that had, during the course of the Yolo County case, been examined and described as similar to the hair of Dave Hunt. That it wasn't an identification. It was basically, it's the same color, it's the same texture. It's not the kind of evidence that we have today in terms of hair analysis. So they tried to say that that was somehow corroborating the Dave Hunt theory. They argued that Joseph was the real killer and the heavy. They argued to try and explain the DNA. They argued that perhaps Richard Hirschfield happened upon the van looking for a place to sleep and just went in and slept there and happened to pleasure himself. The difficulty is he did so in the exact same spot that Sabrina's biological material is found. It was absurd kind of argument. So they questioned the validity of the chain of custody of the incriminating evidence. They argued that it had been tampered with, that evidence could have been planted. The difficulty is this was not blood. This is not something you can easily get a hold of. You can't get a man's sperm without their cooperation. So there's no vials around of Richard Hirschfield's sperm that anyone had access to somehow tamper with this evidence that was 30 years old. So they did the best with what they had to work with, but it led them on these multiple inconsistent theories that eventually ended up backfiring because none of them made sense, let alone any single one.
Dawn, you gave an emotional closing statement. Can you tell us what you were feeling at that point when you were making your final argument to the jury?
I had had this case for almost 10 years at that point. I had known these families through that period of time. I realized the amount of time, money, work, investment that had been made in me and preparing this case and how many people were counting on the right outcome. I felt extreme pressure going into that closing argument and just this sense that this is such a strong case. I have to make sure this jury sees it clearly and that they understand it the way that I understand it's so simple. And I really felt like all I could do is mess this up. And I couldn't face this family and these families and these good people having not done the best I could do. So I felt a great deal of pressure going into closing argument. And then also you have to kind of put a shield on your heart when you're doing these kinds of cases. I had to distance myself because it was so horrific and so emotionally devastating, but you have a job to do as an investigator, as a DA, and I couldn't let myself feel that. And I felt as I started arguing it coming in against my wishes, and I had to really get a handle on it because I didn't want it to impact the argument, but I really felt what I was trying to get the jury to feel.
So the case goes to the jury. What was it like for both of you and the families when you were waiting for the verdict? And then if you can talk about when the verdict came in.
Well, there wasn't a lot of time to wait, fortunately. This case took so long to get to a courtroom, so long to put on, so many battles fought, and the arguments went on for a while, but when the jury went out, they came back with verdicts in 3 hours. So it was literally, but you know, the O.J. Simpson's verdict came back in 3 hours, and that was not a good one. So you always worry when you get a quick verdict that they just didn't see it. I was hopeful, but petrified.
Were the families still here?
Yes,
Okay.
Everybody was waiting. The families were all here in town. Everybody was present for the verdict.
The verdict is read. And what were your thoughts and feelings at that point?
Extreme relief. You never feel good or happy when something like this happens. None of this fixes anything or brings these kids back for these families. I never feel good when a guilty verdict comes. I usually feel a sense of relief that the jury saw it, the right thing happened, the just thing is happening. And I felt so relieved for these families, and they were just full of emotion, extremely relieved. It had been such a long time coming for them. They had lived with this for 30 years, and they were just beside themselves with knowing that you have to understand this family got told in 93, these are the people that killed your kids. And they went through that trial process thinking these are the bad guys. These are the guys that killed our kids. And then they're told on the eve of trial, oops, I'm sorry, wrong people. And they have to deal with that. And they had to deal with then the killers on the loose for another couple decades before they get the call from our office telling them that we have a DNA match. And Anne Marie was actually able to meet with them personally and tell them about it. So they had been through a lot in the justice system by the time this verdict came down. And it really, really meant everything to them. He was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, the murder of John Riggins with the use of a knife and a blunt object. He had used both of those in killing John. He was found guilty of count 2, the first-degree murder of Sombrita Gonzalez with the use of a knife. He was also convicted of 3 separate what's called special circumstance allegations, and these are the allegations that make him eligible for the death penalty. So he was convicted of the fact that these crimes were committed in the course of a kidnapping, that they were committed while he was engaged in the crime of forced oral copulation, and that they were committed during the commission of multiple murders, that more than one person he killed at the same time. So there were 3 special circumstances and 2 counts of first-degree murder.
In our final discussion on the Hirschfield case, we will talk about the sentencing phase, the reactions to the sentence, the impact on the victims' families, and final thoughts on the case from Dawn and Ron.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. You can find all of the Justice Journal podcasts on our website at sacda.org, iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube.